Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Janelle Blue, past president of the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, which is the sponsor of the show. You know, with few exceptions, we all have an immigration story to America. And whether it was from pre-colonial days or whether it's today, those stories, no matter how recent, are really important to genealogists. And we're usually just dependent on a few pieces of information, some correspondence, journals, and that sort of thing. But the stories of more recent immigrants, we can record those and we can have that document firsthand. And so today, I want to welcome Mileva Hartman. And Mileva has an interesting immigrant story, and so we welcome her to tell it today. Welcome, Mileva.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
So you departed Bremerhaven, Germany, in December of 1951 to immigrate to America, and you were part of a refugee family from Germany. But the story starts well before that point. Tell us about your mom. Where was she born, and what do you know about her and her parents?
Well, my mother was born in 1928, and she was born in Reichenbach, near Görlitz. And in Germany, when you have a small town, they identify it with the town that's nearby, so you can zero right in on it. Mm-hmm. And that Görlitz sits right on the Oder River. It is now the easternmost border of Germany. Wasn't always, but you know, different conflicts and history has changed their borders. But that's where she is from, and she was born there. My Oma, my grandmother, was Martha Prohl, and she became a widow fairly early. My mother was only 5 years old. So they moved from Reichenbach to Berlin, the big city, the capital city. Yeah. And so that would have been in the early 30s. Okay. Maybe late 30s, before the war nonetheless. And my grandmother worked as a postmistress there.
Oh wow, that's interesting that they would have a woman to become a postmistress or a postmaster.
And she actually delivered mail twice a day to the apartments, because Berlin's a big city with a lot of multifamily housing. So that's where they were living when the war began. And
they survived the war.
And they did survive the war. Yeah. Now my mother went to school there, so her education really was from Berlin, and they did survive the war, and it's pretty amazing because, as you know, Berlin was one of the most heavily bombed cities in the war. And my mother her growing up years, a lot of them were spent in a bomb shelter.
Oh my gosh!
You know, and the sirens were going off all the time. You know, it was a scary time. And she did finish her elementary school and was going into an apprenticeship, which is the way education was done then. When the war was slowly coming to an end, or quickly coming to an end, perhaps is another way of putting it. Yeah. And about that time, there was the Yalta Conference, just before the end of the war, when it was clear that the Allies were winning. The Yalta Conference took place in February of 1945, and it was when the Axis powers, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in Yalta.
And the Allied powers.
The Allied powers, and they demanded basically the unconditional surrender of Germany. And they also worked out a plan on the aftermath, what would be happening there. Well, when this news came out, and news breaks, you know, there are leaks. My mother said people simply did not believe it. They couldn't believe it. They thought it was, they had been through so many years of Hitler propaganda, misinformation, knowing it isn't always true, that they thought that this was just another scare tactic to keep the German people moving, you know, because nobody wants to have a country divided, and that was the plan.
And it was divided 4 ways, right? U.S., Russia, France, and Britain.
And Britain. It was literally divided into quarters, with Berlin being there pretty much in the center, and it being divided as well. But that was supposed to be a temporary situation. But nonetheless, when it turned out that as the war was quickly now coming to an end, and the German population was pretty darn tired of all this.
I can imagine.
And the news turned out to be true, and when they discovered it was true, they knew, and not just my mother and her family, but everyone on that eastern part of Europe, that would be coming as the Russians had already started moving through.
Wow.
And then they came all the way through. They fled.
Well, the Russians had a pretty bad reputation, didn't they? There was a lot of lot of stuff
Horror
going on.
stories.
The horror stories.
Really
so
horror
that,
stories.
I'm sure that spread, that information was spreading throughout the population.
I mean, my life would have not been here, perhaps, if my mother and my grandmother hadn't fled. And they did. They fled, and they went as far west as they could. And just like Ukraine today, we see the pictures on television of these people whose apartments or whose homes or villages have been destroyed, and they are doing everything to get out. You know, you have buses lined up, you had the train station, and they made a comment on one of the pictures, a current picture of the Ukraine with the folks jammed in the train station platform. You may have seen it. And they compared it with a picture of World War II. Identical almost.
It was the same.
It was the same. And so my mother and grandmother were caught up with that, along with lots of other Europe, not necessarily all Germans. Poles were getting the heck out of there. You know, the Lithuanians, the Estonians, the Latvians, they were moving as quickly as they could to the west because they didn't want to be under Russian control.
So your mom and your grandmother picked up a few possessions, and they said, "We're out of here, and we don't even know where we're going."
That's exactly right. They didn't have family in the West. They had no idea where they were going. They just knew they had to go.
So they found a train.
Everyone's rushing to train stations, and there were probably many trains as there are in Ukraine, leaving it, you know, helping people get out of there. And my mother and grandmother were on a train, and she said most of the trains were women, children, old men, maybe some wounded soldiers. I mean, it was just a train of sad refugees getting the heck out of there. And they were on the train, and there was a certain date, and I wish I had that date, but there was a certain date in which the Yalta conference, the Yalta agreement, literally took place.
When those divisions were going to take place.
Were officially made, yep. And they were on the train at the time. But they were on the train that had just crossed into, apparently, the British sector. It was British, French, American, and Russian. And the train was stopped, and anyone who was on the other side was considered Russian property, basically.
So the train stopped in the middle of the dividing line, and your mom and grandmother were on the British side, in the front?
Closer to the front. And they unlatched the train, you know how the cars are unlatched, and the others had to stay there.
Oh my gosh, can you imagine being the one that didn't get to cross?
Can you? I mean, now my mother left, my grandmother had been married before and had an adult child who was my aunt, many years older, 14, 15 years older than my mother. And she was still in Görlitz, in the home, in Reichenbach, in the home that she had lived in all of her life. She was married to a German soldier and had 2 children already. So they did not flee. They probably couldn't have. That was so far over.
Oh, yeah.
Probably couldn't have. Many years later, I did meet them, though. But so that's how they got into the West, and they were in the British sector. And there was, the Allies they knew that there was this influx of people coming, and they did provide camps for them to live in.
So when your mom got off the train,
they had to find shelter.
They had to find shelter, and I assume their refugee groups were there to meet them because they knew this was happening?
Sure, yeah.
So they took them to shelter.
There were shelters, and they were very primitive built barracks-like shelters, you know. As a matter of fact, I have a picture where I was 19 months old on a pillow, and you could see the unpainted wood in the background. So they were temporary housing for many, many people, you know, at that time. And so that's my mother's story and how she got to the West until she met my father. Now, she was young, because think about it, born in 28, when the war started, let's say by 40, she was 12, 42, she was only 14.
Yeah.
So in 1945, she was 17.
Okay. All right. Well, so she made it on the train, and she made it into the British sector. So now let's talk a little bit about your dad.
Well,
and before we do that, we have a picture of the family, and let's go ahead and put that up because that will show your mom and your dad, and that's an adorable picture of you, Mileva. I think you're the oldest one, right? With the so that's your family, huh?
And that was taken actually in March. We arrived in America in December of 1951 on my birthday. We arrived on Christmas Eve in that town.
Wow.
And so that picture was taken in March by the pastor of the church. And we knew he was coming to visit, and so we all had big bows in our hair.
That's
in our Sunday best.
All right, well, let's back up and talk about your dad a little bit. because he wasn't German, was he?
No, my father wasn't. And my name was Mileva Maria Sretenovic. So my mother, Krista Pro, Martha Pro was my Oma. Krista Pro became Krista Sretenovic.
Okay.
And my name was Mileva Maria Sretenovic. Sounds like a ballerina.
Yes.
Alas. So my father was Milan Sretenovic, and Milan is a very common Serbian name.
Yes.
My name, Mileva, is pretty well known in Eastern Europe. Bulgarians, Romanians, Russians, Yugoslavs, Croats, they all know the name Mileva. Here it's kind of unusual. There it's just another name, for a woman. Anyway, my father was born in 1919, so the World War I had ended. In 1918, the country of Yugoslavia came together, and came together with these different provinces that were really not independent countries per se,
Now, I have a picture of the map. Encyclopedia Britannica, this is their picture, so I give him credit for it. But you can describe that a little better with the picture there.
Well, the main countries at that point was Slovenia, Croatia, and Serbia, and they came together as land of the Southern Slavs. It became what became Yugoslavia, and these other areas joined. And they did it for protection because nobody had ever heard of those countries. But if you look around, they abut, pretty strong countries. So for protection, they came together. And in 1929, it became the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. It was renamed Kingdom of Yugoslavia. And they did have a king. The king happened to be Serbian. And I think it was King Peter. So here you have Yugoslavia now formed. And it was around, as you know, until what, 1992?
Yeah,
I think was when it fell apart again.
Right.
So it wasn't a long-time country, but it was ruled by a king who was underage and had a conservator who did his business for him, if you will, who had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler, because by 1939, and Hitler had invaded Poland and was continuing to move on, and he was going to gobble up all of Europe. He had, of course, as an ally, Mussolini.
Right, Italy.
And so, and if you see the map there, you see the location of how close they were.
Yeah.
So when the king became the official ruler because he became of age, he had been in contact with the Allies and pledged his troops to the Allies, even though there was that non-aggression pact.
Okay.
So Hitler had no qualms about moving right on in. And the Italians moved in from the west. Hitler moved in from the north. And there are many, many books written about that. And you had a great resistance in Yugoslavia the king fled in 1941, so you didn't have an official anything, but my father had been drafted into the king's army for protection.
Okay.
It was a defense force that they had.
So he was a soldier, and he was basically fighting against Hitler.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, he didn't have much of a chance to fight against Hitler because they came in very quickly. They were overrun.
Yeah.
I mean, this was a small army. The king had fled, so you have a disarray.
Right.
And you have in the country a revolution going on with Tito.
Okay, Tito's already there at that point.
He's there as a revolutionary, and he was and he had also signed a pact with Hitler. Hitler allowed Tito to go ahead and take over the country, but Hitler had invaded, and then went and took all these. And somewhere, I think it was Wikipedia that talks about the fact that there were hundreds of thousands of Yugoslav soldiers of all those different provinces, Croats, Serbs, Slovenians, Macedonians, that were picked up by the Germans and taken to prisoner of war camps in Germany.
In Germany, and that's how your dad got to Germany.
That's how he got to Germany, not his choice. He was on a farm, a prison camp, a POW camp, and it happened to be on a prison farm where there were a few guards guarding them for the most part, but they were there with nowhere to go. And in that camp there were a number of other Eastern European soldiers that had been captured by the Germans. I mean, you had Latvians, you had Romanians, you had Bulgarians, and my father, having a Slavic language, was able to communicate somewhat with some of those people.
I was going to ask you if he knew German before they sent him to Germany. So
No, he sure
had to
didn't.
learn that language.
And he learned it in a bad way. He learned it, well, barely, because remember, you're in a prisoner of war camp and you don't have the normal conversations with other Germans.
Right.
You pick up words, of course you
Yeah.
do. But he was already in his 20s. But he did learn some of these other languages and was able to communicate with those that had a common base, the Slavic language. Even Russian, you know, a little common base there. So he was there until the war ended. That prison camp was near Braunschweig. And I wish I could tell you what Braunschweig is near, but it's relatively well known.
It's a well-known, yeah,
And
it is.
and it was and so he was released. The prison camp was released by the British when they came in. So all those foreign prisoners of war in Germany were now stuck here, weren't they?
They were stuck in the British sector
in
Germany, and so they were they
displaced persons.
displaced, but the British military, they had jobs, right?
They had jobs, and you know, we talk about the British military, but there was also British civilian there, just as we had American civilians in the occupation during a part of the occupation. So my father was put in a British Army uniform and was given housing there in the barracks, and they worked alongside the British soldiers, when the Brits were trying to lessen their own troops, of course,
Right.
because they had fought there for so long, and so worked alongside the British soldiers as a part of the occupation force.
And that's how he met your mother.
And that's how he met my mother. He knew his buddy was dating a German woman, and she had a friend.
And the rest is history.
The rest is history. So yeah, so that happened in 40. Met her probably in 40, 45, into 45,
yeah.
no doubt.
Yeah.
And they got married in 46, and I was born in 46.
And by that time, your mom was living out of the refugee camp. They had found some place to
An
like an
apartment.
apartment of
My
some
Oma
sort.
was still with us.
But your dad couldn't live there, right?
No, he didn't. He couldn't live with us, but he lived nearby, and because he would come on weekends, obviously. They had 3 children.
So those were good weekends.
So, and we lived with our Oma, and my mother worked at a canning factory, as a matter of fact, during that time. But the entire time, my father and all those other soldiers were viewed as an occupying force. They were not citizens of the country, and there was no work to be had if they decided to quit. You know, where were they going to go? And that wasn't just our family. A lot of families had that dilemma. Where were they going to go? Certainly those soldiers, like my father, were not really still welcomed by the Germans, or
Right,
you know,
right, yeah.
they had fought against them, you know.
Right.
So they early on tried to get immigration out of Germany somehow, and my father knew that position with the British was very temporary.
So there was information that you all were able to obtain as to different places that you might have been able to immigrate to, and your family really wanted to go to the U.S. Right?
And I think, you know, from what Mother says, most people wanted to go to the U.S.
Yeah.
And these countries were very open, very generous. I mean,
Yeah.
Canada opened its arms, Australia opened its arms. Chile, there's a lot of Yugoslavs in Chile and Argentina. These were countries that still had land and shortage of manpower because a war had been fought, and
Yeah.
you know, think of all the manpower that was lost. So just about everyone in that position was immigrating out. Later on, we met a family from Latvia that had also been on the waiting list for a while and came to America.
So let's talk about how you connected with the organization that actually sponsored you.
Okay, well, how we connected, I'm not sure. But that organization was an organization called the World Church Service, I believe is what it was, headquartered out of New York. And it was really an alliance that sent out the word, you know, and we've done this in America after Vietnam, after the Hungarian Revolution and all. Who was willing to sponsor, take in a family, and be responsible, or families if that's possible? And a small church in Piketon, Ohio, who had one of their sons be in the war and be a prisoner of war, said, we'll make this happen. And they had to be a sponsor. So they submitted their name.
And Piketon is just sort of a small village, or not a village.
It's a village.
But
it's called the Village of Piketon, and it's on Route 23 in Ohio, near the Ohio River.
Okay.
And not much going on there, farmland. Not an industrial town. Whereas there were churches all over America who, as I said, raised their hand and said, we'll take a family or two. And some might have had some requirements. They could only find housing maybe for a single person or just a couple. They might not have had a house available for larger families. By this time, there were 3 of us.
So they had to
girls.
have housing, they had to
Have
be
a job,
prepared
an
to
address.
feed you for until you could get on your feet. And then your dad, they had to have a job for your dad
They had
too,
to have
right?
a job, yeah. And the job started almost the day after we arrived in Piketon.
Wow.
But here we are now. The church we are on a ship, the General C.C. Ballou, and it is an Army transport that has been converted into a
We have a
refugee
picture
ship.
of that.
Oh, okay.
We have a quick picture of that, yeah, and then we're going to have that picture again in a minute. But
Not a cruise ship. We didn't have windows.
It's a transport ship.
Transport ship that had spent how many years bringing soldiers to Germany, bringing them back home, bringing POWs from here back to Germany. And so we and 3,000 others were on that ship, and it took us a long time to cross the Atlantic because it was wintertime. And I think you found the record that showed that we left on the 9th of December and we arrived in a pier in New York on the 22nd of December. And
there was somebody waiting for you there
from
when you
this
got off?
agency, someone from the agency waiting for us and waiting for others to connect up with, and we got a bus ticket.
Uh-huh.
And the bus
you
ticket,
didn't even know where you were going, right?
And when we got the bus ticket, it still was meaningless. We got the bus ticket, and it said Piqueton, Ohio. It was Piketon, Ohio. And so my mother, my father, and we 3 girls got on a Greyhound bus. And I don't know how long it took. I was, going to be 5, but we arrived at the bus stop, which was a sign that said bus. In Piketon, Ohio, near a gas station, and the pastor of the Piketon Methodist Church, which later became the Piketon Jasper Methodist Church, was there to meet us. Spoke English, we didn't. We spoke very few words. We curtsied. We knew hello, we knew goodbye, we knew thank you, and that was it.
Oh my gosh.
And he put us in the car and took us to a farmhouse a few miles out of the town. And there was a Christmas tree. The house was decorated. There were some church members there to welcome us, and they had dinner ready. And it must have been early evening, but it was December, so it was already dark. And it was also my 5th birthday.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
oh
it
my
kind of brings
goodness.
tears to my eyes. It was a small house. It only had the 3 rooms. But we didn't know what to expect. So this was a welcome beyond what we would have, imagined even.
Yeah.
So my father did go to work in a feed mill there. A feed mill, people who live in rural areas know what they are. That's where you have the silos and they sell the feed and the fertilizer and all that. So my father went to work there and worked most of his adult life as manual labor there.
So in the few minutes that we have remaining, just sort of fast forward, it's a real success story because you and all of your sisters graduated from high school, you got your college degrees, and then you joined the Navy. And we have a wonderful picture of Mileva as a brand new, what was your rank
Well,
there?
that is a brand new Navy captain.
Ah, okay.
No, I thought
all right.
I had sent a picture earlier where
Maybe
it was an
you did.
ensign. But anyway, now that was me toward the end of my career.
Okay, but anyway, that's the success story. And then let's tell the story just because then you went on to have good careers in different industries. You were with the National Science Foundation for a while and some others. And you married, you've got a daughter, you've got a new grandson. And but there's one story I think that is so poignant, and because we're running out of time, I don't want to miss this story.
Okay.
And so you tell the story of you and General Berkman, and we can go back to that ship now.
Okay. Well, I did graduate from Ohio University, and I did join the Navy. I mean, I didn't have any money at all, and I joined the Navy, and I was an ensign, and I served 2 years, and I met my husband in the Navy. I got out at the end of 2 years. Back then, people couldn't get married or have children. That's changed, of course. But I got out of the Navy, and I stayed in the Navy Reserve, and I cheer on the Navy Reserve and any of the reserves. So I stayed in. So I had, both whatever civilian job I had. I worked in New York City in an advertising agency, and then I was recalled to active duty in 1984, which brought us to Washington. And I was given it was a 6-month tour and became another 6-month tour, and my husband found a job here. So we have lived here in this Northern Virginia area for 38 years now. Yeah. And I served 14 years in the Pentagon, both on the staff of the CNO, Chief of Naval Operations, and also in the Office of the Secretary of Defense.
And that's where you met Major General Berkman.
That's where I met Major General Berkman, Bill Berkman. And he was very formal. He was a very, tall, straight. I was intimidated by him, and it was a very small office. But there was no chit chat. I mean, it was very,
Right.
We had a job to do, and we all did it. We all respected him greatly. Well, in 1992, I got that job in '92 on the Reserve Forces Policy Board. In 1992, the general retired and went back to his home in Sausalito, California. But we used him. He was the Secretary of the Army. Recalled him to serve as a consultant whenever we had big board meetings, because he was so knowledgeable. And he was coming back as a civilian in civilian clothes, and all colonels that were on that floor, put him in a little alcove area, and he was able to eavesdrop and hear our conversations, and so he got to know more about me and my background a little bit. And he would come out once in a while and ask me, things, because there was a war in Bosnia going on at the time, and he knew that I was of Serbian descent. So we chatted about that. In 1999. Anyway, I left the Navy. In 1999, I get an envelope in the mail, and it's a black and white photo of the General C.C. Ballou, the ship that you just had put up there.
Put the picture of the ship back, please.
Just a picture of it, and so that was the General C.C. Ballou. And I had a postcard, and I think in my conversations with him, I shared that postcard with him, because I knew it was an Army transport, and he had been in the Army. Well, lo and behold, I get this picture, and it just... I can't even tell you, I was amazed, because he had a sticky on it. He has an X there. You see that X?
Yeah.
And on the back, he had written something like, X marks my stateroom, Betty Ann. Betty Ann was his fiancée. The ship we came over was going to be decommissioned. It was the last cruise across the Atlantic carrying refugees. Indeed, it was not decommissioned. It went around Cape Horn. It went to San Francisco and picked up...
After they had dropped you off.
New York Harbor. We went direct from Germany to New York Harbor. It went around Cape Horn to San Francisco, and it picked up a newly commissioned second lieutenant, Bill Berkman, and sent him to the war in Korea. 1992. We arrived in December 1951. And in 1992, he's in Korea. And in 1942, he's in Korea. 1952, he's in Korea. In 1992, we are working together in the same office in the Pentagon. And it's just a small world story. What can I say?
Is it coincidence? Is it karma? Is it, who knows?
Who knows?
Mileva, this is such an interesting story. We could just keep talking forever, but we've run out of time. Thank you so much.
Well, everyone has a story, but thank you. It was a pleasure being here.
Good.